Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in and imagine for a second that you're stepping inside a dimly lit Victorian photography studio. The year is somewhere in the late 1800s. It's this fascinating era, right on the cusp of modern technological marvels, but still deeply, deeply entrenched in a harsh, everyday reality. And as you walk into the space, the sensory details hit you immediately.
The atmosphere is just incredibly heavy. Thick velvet curtains are pulled tight to block out the sun so the photographer can control the exposure. There's this sharp metallic smell of chemical fumes drifting out from the darkroom. You spot a massive wooden camera mounted on a sturdy tripod. And right there, smack in the center of the room, sits a grieving family. A mother in black mourning clothes, a father staring rigidly ahead, the kids standing silently. But right between them, meticulously posed upright, is a recently deceased child.
Now, take a really close look at these two girls sitting side by side. The sheer level of craftsmanship used to deceive the eye here is mind-blowing. At a quick glance, they both look totally alive, right? Well, this is actually a post-mortem portrait meant to defy death itself. Notice that unnatural rigidity in the girl on the right? Her eyes were painstakingly painted directly onto the photograph after it developed, and that rosy tint on her cheeks added by hand to create this striking and, definitely unsettling illusion of life.
Okay, I know exactly what you're thinking. To our modern eyes, this whole practice feels horrifying, literally macabre. It goes completely against how we use photography today. But we've got to set our 21st century biases aside for a minute. Throughout this explainer, we're going to see how staging these post-mortem portraits wasn't born out of morbidity at all. It was actually one of the most profound, desperate acts of love in Western history.
Section 1. A time of constant loss. The tragic reality of the 19th century.
So, to really understand the why behind this custom, we have to look at the world they were living in. Taking thousands of casual snaps on a smartphone, that was a century away. Photography was rare, the process was painfully slow, and it was ridiculously expensive. Because of that, most families, especially working-class ones, had absolutely zero pictures of their loved ones while they were alive. And into this world with no visual records, tragedy just struck constantly. Victorians lived before modern medicine, before antibiotics and vaccines. Diseases that are totally treatable today were relentless killers. We're talking tuberculosis, scarlet fever, pneumonia, cholera, measles. They just tore through communities. Infant mortality was so horrifyingly high that in some major cities, nearly half of all children never even reached adulthood.
For a grieving family, like the large one gathered stoically around the tiny coffin here, the situation was utterly heartbreaking. They had no visual memory of that baby. None. So this photograph wasn't some spooky novelty. It was a desperate act of emotional preservation. It was literally their first and absolutely their final chance to capture their child's face before it was lost to the earth forever. They were taking this devastating loss and integrating it directly into the enduring visual record of their family.
Section 2. Staging the illusion of life. The tricks of the death trade.
Let's get into the actual mechanics of how this became an entire booming industry. Because demand was so crazy high, specialized photographers emerged who dedicated their whole careers to mourning photography. And speed was absolutely everything. Without modern embalming, decomposition started incredibly fast. So these photographers would rush straight to family homes, lugging all their heavy equipment to stage the dead before it was too late. To beat the clock, they followed these exact, elaborate steps to create a temporary denial of death. They used hidden metal stands strapped behind the subject to hold the body perfectly upright. They'd painstakingly arrange the hair, position the arms to look natural, and bring in fresh flowers to soften the grim reality of the scene. And here's a wild irony for you. Because early cameras needed super long exposure times, the living folks often turned out slightly blurry in the final shot because, well, they couldn't help but breathe or blink. The corpses, though, they remained perfectly still, which meant the dead often looked sharper and more in focus than their living, grieving relatives.
Section 3. Posing the sleeping angels. Romanticizing an overwhelming grief.
Since child death was such a devastatingly common event, Victorian culture had to develop heavy emotional rituals just to cope with the sheer volume of loss. They started portraying their deceased kids not as corpses, but as peaceful, sleeping angels. It was a motif that showed up everywhere, in their literature, on their gravestones, and, naturally, in their photography. Just look at the child resting on the dark leather couch here. She's positioned so perfectly to look like she's just taking a quiet afternoon nap. Dressed all in white, surrounded by symbolic flowers, the reality of death wasn't hidden away in some sterile hospital room. It was openly witnessed, beautifully staged, and physically remembered by the family. They were actively crafting a memory of peaceful rest rather than agonizing illness. I really want you to notice the profound intimacy happening here. Look at the mother calmly sitting right beside her deceased child, softly resting her hand against the little girl's head, with the living sibling standing close by. The parents didn't just stand off to the side, right? They physically touched, held, and posed with the dead. This highly hands-on interaction made the actual taking of the photograph an active, vital part of the grieving ritual itself.
The crucial takeaway here is looking at the rigid, grieving posture of these parents. I mean, you can practically feel the heavy silence in the room. The mother looks down in absolute sorrow, supporting the baby's head, while the father sits close, sharing the crushing weight of the moment. They're using the camera as a weapon to fight back against the unstoppable force of mortality, pausing time for just a few seconds to cement their child's existence into history. This quote really hits the nail on the head. The photograph became a fragile bridge between presence and absence. In a world where mortality was literally everywhere, I mean, Queen Victoria herself set the tone for the whole era by going into decades of deep public mourning after her husband died. These treasured heirloom portraits allowed families to hold on to a physical identity that was otherwise slipping away into the void.
Section 4. Modern discomfort with death. Why we look away today.
So, if these photos were born out of such pure love and devotion, why is our first instinct today to look away? Why do these images feel so eerie or even supernatural to us? Well, the answer lies in how dramatically our culture has shifted over the last century. Just look at the stark contrast between these two realities. In the Victorian era, death happened right inside the family home. Bodies were washed by family members, kept in the parlor room, and mourned, highly visibly. Death was a constant, intimate companion. But in our modern reality, the 20th century completely professionalized dying. We moved death into hospitals, we handed bodies over to funeral homes, and we effectively hid the entire process behind closed doors.
Because today, we strictly associate family photography with vitality, happy vacations, and celebrating life, these ghostly images violently clash with our expectations. They strip away our modern comforts and confront us with a deeply uncomfortable truth that we spend a lot of time trying to ignore. The fact that every portrait, no matter when it was taken, is ultimately a record of mortality.
Section 5. A weapon against forgetting. The universal fear of disappearance.
If we can just manage to look past our modern biases, we can see the sheer humanity at work here. We can recognize that post-mortem photography wasn't some morbid obsession with the dead. It was fundamentally a desperate, beautiful battle against the fading of memory. The Victorians knew exactly what we know. Over time, voices vanish and faces blur in our minds. We really have to empathize with the people in these portraits. What would drive a heartbreaking parent to hire a stranger, bring heavy equipment into their home, and hold their deceased child perfectly still for a camera lens while breathing in chemical fumes? It wasn't madness. It was a raw instinct that every parent, every single human who has loved someone deeply, understands perfectly.
It's exactly like this quote beautifully states. These photos were taken because someone loved someone deeply and could not bear to lose their face forever. These portraits weren't made to be archived on the internet or to creep us out centuries later. They were intensely private. They were kissed, they were carried around in lockets, and they were cherished as one final, tangible illusion of presence by families who had literally just lost their entire world.
Take a look at this final, truly haunting image of a mother sitting beside a veiled figure. It completely collapses the boundary between the living and the dead. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this lingering thought. When you look at these literal ghosts of the past, does stripping away our modern sanitized fear of death finally allow you to understand them? Does it help us see the timeless, heartbreaking lengths we'll go to using whatever technology we have at our disposal just to preserve the ones we love?